Hi everyone, I'm back with the 1920 diary entry for the day. The date is 30th/17th December. So we're still a ways off from the Christmas on the Julian calendar. And it will be interesting to see how Dmitri and Maria and other members of the community celebrate Russian Christmas. But as I say, we have a ways to go before that happens. So the diary entry was written on a Thursday in Monte Carlo in room 237 of the Hotel de Paris. And it's quite a long one. So I've decided to cut it into two pieces for two different videos. Otherwise, I'll end up going on forever and ever. And Dmitri had an odd way of writing his diaries. Not as a child, but as an adult, he would write short. Well, he would write every 10 days, usually. He would write a very long, very expressive, sometimes introspective diary entry. I mean, we're talking it could be as much as 20 pages. And then when he had finished that, he was taking notes every day. And when he'd finished the long diary entry, he would go back 10 days. And based on his notes, reconstruct each of those days and write a diary entry for each of those days. So, yeah, odd way of doing it, but it seemed to work for him. And on this occasion, this is not one of the long summary diary entries. This is just a diary entry, a daily diary entry that was longer than usual. And it's the last one for this volume of his diaries. And he writes so much that typically his diaries, each volume, instead of covering a year, usually only covers about 3 months. And the good news is that pretty soon we'll be starting, when we go into 1921, we'll be starting with the romance with Coco Chanel and that relationship. So that will be interesting, I promise. All right, so in this first part of the diaries, there's the whole issue with Borya, and then we go into, he meets with another member of the family whom he hasn't seen. His aunt, he refers to her, but she was a cousin, Grand Duchess Anastasia Mikhailovna, who had married the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. And there's an interesting conversation that goes on there. So I will dive into it. Maria turned up in the morning. Naturally, we talked about Gulia. Apparently, the mood in Saint Ramon is pretty strained, and of course that is terribly unpleasant for Maria. Gulia continues to accuse me of boorishness and says it's very difficult for him to deal with me. That's very unpleasant for me, mainly because I thought Gulia loved me. I thought we had a good, warm relationship, but now it turns out that he's resented me for a very long time. I lunched with Aunt Anastasia Mikhailovna. Mikhail Mikhailovich was there too, and her illegitimate son, Alexei Mikhailovich, whom she is giving blank. He's very young, a well-brought-up boy of around 20. Misha blank began to lay out for me his impressions of Kirill, whom he sees all the time in Cannes. Apparently, Misha said a lot of unpleasant things to him, among other things declaring that the Russian colony doesn't wish to accept him. Then Misha blanked me and said he had declared en toute lettres to Kirill that neither he nor his brothers have a right to the throne in view of the fact that Uncle Vladimir abdicated. Of course, it's frightfully hard to believe everything old Misha says, and in this instance, one must be extremely skeptical. On top of everything else, he probably made tons of gaffes for which Kirill will never forgive me. After lunch, Anastasia Mikhailovna asked me to come upstairs and warned me that Misha very readily veers away from the truth. All right, we'll stop there. Such an interesting interval. Going back to the whole thing with Gulia, Dmitri uses the same term as before, chamstva. This time I've translated it as boorishness. It could be rudeness or nastiness. You get the picture at any rate. All right, the lunch. So Aunt Anastasia Mikhailovna, she was the only daughter of the Caucasian branch of the family. So you remember, if you're watching the videos for the 1906 diaries, or if you know all about the Romanovs already, this is the daughter of Grand Duke Mikhail Nikolaevich, who was the son of Nicholas I, and his wife, who was German. And so she, like her brothers, was raised in the Caucasus, and if you want to read about her, you can find some information, I can't remember how much, in Sandro's book of memoirs, Once a Grand Duke, and he talks about how he and his brothers were sometimes jealous of their sister because they were raised in a very, very strict way, like they were living in a military school with corporal punishment and all that sort of thing, whereas their sister was just allowed to be her parents' darling and have a much more relaxed existence. So these are siblings, Anastasia Mikhailovna and Mikhail Mikhailovich, who was a Russian Grand Duke. Anastasia was married, as I mentioned, to the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. She was about 70 years old at the time of this meeting with Dmitri, and she had 3 children with the Duke, but she also had a natural son that she'd had with her personal secretary or private secretary, who had a Russian surname, but this boy was called, Dmitri refers to him as Alexei Mikhailovich, but his name was actually Alexis Louis de Wenden. Okay, and he was a little younger than Dmitri was guessing. He was, I think, 18 instead of 20 at that time. And Dmitri clearly does not hold it against him that he is a child that his cousin had out of wedlock. He refers to him as a very well brought up boy and seems to like him. Okay, and Mikhail Mikhailovich, who was, I think, 59 at the time. Now that was a complicated situation because he had been banished from Russia the same year Dmitri had been born, and he'd never been allowed to come back. I don't know why other Grand Dukes, including Dmitri's father, were allowed to come back having committed the same violation, which was that they all married morganatically. But for some reason, the Tsar never allowed Mish-Mish, as Dmitri calls him in earlier diary entries, never allowed him to come back. And even though, as I understand it, Mikhail Mikhailovich was corresponding with Nicholas and more or less begging him to come back, and he had financial problems because when he was banished from Russia, he no longer got his appanage income. And I have some pictures of him from David Chavchavadz's book. There's one of him as a young man before he was banished from Russia. And here's one of him when he was living in England, which is primarily where he settled. He also lived in Cannes, but he and his wife and their 3 children lived in England in the years when Dmitri was living in England in 1919, 1920. And so Dmitri was very often invited to their house and was a guest at their house. And he really more or less held Mikhail in contempt. He really disliked him and really says some unflattering things about him. And so I'm a little surprised in this instance that he seems to be more tolerant of Mikhail than usual. Previously, he just didn't have the time of day for this guy. He did have a close relationship with the 3 children, the 2 daughters, and yeah, there was a very interesting incident involving one of the daughters that kind of blew up, and Dmitri was staying with them, and he said, well, I'm going to leave, and they said, I'm going to leave, give me a ride to the into town or to the train station. And they said, well, if you're leaving, you can bloody well take the subway. And that whole thing wasn't good, but they did see a lot of each other, and presumably they mended their fences. And so the son of the family, also named Mikhail Mikhailovich, but called Boy within the family. So Dmitri always refers to him as Boy, and he had the surname Torby, so he was called Boy Torby. And yeah, he was okay, I guess. Dmitri was willing to spend some time with him, but found that he kind of was a little hard to get rid of if they were spending the day together. And then I remember on one occasion when Dmitri sort of wanted to spend some personal time with the young woman that the 3 of them had, the 2 of them had spent the day with, and Boy just wouldn't take a hint. But anyway, there was an issue around both Mikhail Mikhailovich around this time, and also around Boy in later years, which was that they seem to have had some mental health crises. And Boy definitely did. Apparently he was prone to really serious depression. I mean, Dmitri was prone to depression too, but not to the extent that it really incapacitated him the way it did Boy Torby. And in fact, Boy Torby would end up in a kind of posh mental health facility for, wealthy and prestigious people. And my godmother remembered visiting him and him sort of flitting around. And apparently it was a place that had this really nice, beautiful estate that even had extensive grounds. And so some of the men who were there as part of the visit had brought guns with them. I think shotguns with them to do some bird hunting. And Sonia remembered that Boy was kind of erratically darting around, and one of the women, I can't remember who, she did tell me, was saying, don't shoot Boy, don't shoot Boy. So apparently by that point he was pretty far gone. And apparently his father at this time was having some mental health issues as well. And that's maybe the basis on which Anastasia made it a point of taking Dmitri aside so she could tell him privately not to really take what Misha was saying seriously. So what was Misha saying? This gets really interesting. So Kirill was apparently living in Cannes at that time, or spending some time in Cannes. And Misha was also living in Cannes at that time, and so the 2 of them would run into each other. And according to Misha, he had sort of had it out with Kirill and told him, what does he say? He claimed that he said a lot of unpleasant things, among other things declaring that the Russian colony doesn't wish to accept him, and that neither he nor his brothers had a right to the throne in view of the fact that Uncle Vladimir abdicated. Yeah, so a lot to unpack there. At that time, Dmitri was also claiming that in general, the Russian emigre community in France and in England wanted nothing to do with Kirill. They still considered him a traitor because of his march to the Duma wearing a red ribbon when the revolution first broke out. and they just wanted nothing to do with him, and Dmitri didn't want anything to do with him. And Dmitri, actually, before he had come to Monte Carlo, was having and arranging meetings with various important people in the Russian immigration, and he had specifically asked those people to go to Kirill and to tell Kirill that he would never be accepted as a claimant to the throne, and he needed to stop all this nonsense at once. That had been something Dmitri had been trying to organize, and he was very upset when he returned from a trip to London and discovered that these men hadn't followed through with that. And his excuse for not doing it himself, and for in fact leaving France for a while, so he wouldn't run into Kirill, was that if he were to be face to face with Kirill, he would lose his temper and it would get bad quickly. And he'd already had a run-in with Kirill's wife, who arrived in Paris quite a bit before Kirill himself did. And they'd had this confrontation, and she had told him that he should be shot as a traitor. And he doesn't go into detail on what basis she considered him a traitor, but he kind of she insisted that he go with her to various social events so that this rift in the imperial family would be covered up and wouldn't be perceived. And he went along with that. He kind of let her bully him, even though she'd said that really horrible thing to him. And he wasn't going to have the same thing happen with Kirill. Whether he really thought he would lose his temper, or whether he thought Kirill would manage to persuade him, I don't know. But now here he is, being kind of unhappy that Misha had said these things to Kirill. So this issue of Uncle Vladimir abdicating. Well, this was Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich. Certainly have a photo of him, and he was Alexander II's younger brother, so he would have been he was Alexander III's younger brother. He was the third son of the Emperor Alexander II, and when the eldest son Nikolai died, that made him the heir after Alexander, after the Tsarevich Alexander. But then, of course, once Alexander had children, Alexander III, then Vladimir was no longer that close to the succession. Here he is with his children, Kirill, Andrei, and Boris, and their sister. I think her name was Yelena, and Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna the Elder, not to be confused with Dmitri's sister. So, apparently, Vladimir had been quite ambitious. And in fact, his older brother Nicholas had said, Vladimir, you should be the heir to the throne because your name means ruler of the world, which in fact it does. So Mir is world, and Vladi comes from the word for ruler, and we can all bear that in mind when we think of Vladimir Putin, of course, who has some ambitions of his own. So did Vladimir abdicate? I have never heard that he did. But I can say that when Kirill married his first cousin, who was also a divorcee and was banished, like so many other Grand Dukes, from Russia by Nicholas II, Vladimir, who was Vladimir's nephew, Vladimir came and saw Nicholas and apparently screamed at him and said, all right, that's it. I'm finished. I'm no longer serving you as a Grand Duke. All of that is over. So it may have been on that basis that that this claim was made that he had actually abdicated. But of course, even if he had abdicated, that would not have given him the right to abdicate on behalf of his children, as far as I know, as far as my reading of the sort of foundational laws on the imperial family that were enacted in 1797 by the Emperor Paul I, and I don't remember anything about that. In fact, there are some people who claim that that Alexei Nikolaevich, Nicholas II's son, was actually the Tsar of Russia after Nicholas abdicated, even though Nicholas also explicitly abdicated on behalf of his son. So I don't know, the ins or outs of that, but it's I guess a silly thing to argue about because effectively there was no Russians around at that part. But anyway, I am digressing. I have one more thing to say about that, and that does involve how Dmitri is reacting to this news that Misha claims to have said some really hard things and unpleasant things, as he puts it, to Kirill. He probably made tons of gaffes, Dmitri writes, for which Kirill will never forgive me. So why would Kirill not forgive Dmitri for gaffes that Mikhail Mikhailovich had made? And why would Dmitri care whether Kirill forgave him or not, considering how hostile Dmitri had been? I mean, really hostile to Kirill in earlier diary entries. Well, I guess he figured that, among other things that Mish-Mish said to Kirill, he told Kirill exactly what Dmitri had said about Kirill. So that wouldn't be good, especially if he had this tendency to exaggerate. It was bad enough as it was. So, yeah, I'm sure that's what Dmitri was worried about. And then why was he worried about that? Why didn't he want Kirill to know explicitly? I'm sure Kirill knew in a general sense that Dmitri was avoiding him and not happy about his claim and didn't support him in any way. But why didn't Dmitri want Kirill to hear these things that he said, in which case Kirill would probably never forgive him? Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? I'm not sure. Was it because he would have been embarrassed? I don't know. He still was in the running, so to speak, to be the claimant to the throne, and in fact still had this upcoming monarchist conference in Berlin where he would be all but proclaimed by that group of Russian monarchists as the principal claimant to the throne. So it surprised me a little bit. I'd, of course, read this diary entry before, but this was the first time that kind of jumped out at me. So, anyway, we will have the second half next time. So please come back for that. And that will be a whole different ball of wax. That will be about what went on the evening of the 30th of December. All right, see you then. Bye.